Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 326. This time we're going to talk about this record by the soul jazz organ whiz Charles Earland, live at the Lighthouse on Prestige from 1972. This is a promotional copy, which sounds pretty good, although I will say, like a lot of other soul jazz organ records where the organist is basically doubling up on the bass pedals rather than having a bass guitarist, that works well in a club. It doesn't always translate well onto the record. So you could quibble and say it lacks a little bit of bottom end, but notwithstanding all that, this record really, really cooks. In the late 1950s and 1960s, there was a whole wave of fantastic exponents of the Hammond B3 organ who played soul jazz. People like Jack McDuff, people like Jimmy Smith, people like Shirley Scott, tons of others. As an organist, Charles Earland is actually from a slightly younger generation. Despite his place in music history being associated to the Hammond organ, he actually began his career and actually up to the level of being a professional musician as a saxophonist. He switches to the Hammond in his early 20s, self taught, and goes on to be pretty much one of the greatest players of the instrument. That reputation is in part because of his supremely groovy playing, but also because he was a heck of an arranger. He could take the most overplayed or hackneyed pop song of the day and turn it into a soul jazz classic or a jazz funk classic. His greatest period in terms of musical output was undoubtedly the early 1970s when he was recording for Prestige. This record captures all of the energy and all of the tremendous connection that he had with audiences at the time. It's recorded in 1972 at the famous Lighthouse Cafe in Hermosa Beach in LA. Charles Earland was born in May 1941 in Philadelphia. There was musical talent in the family. His mom played piano, his dad was a sax player, but he never received any training on the keyboards at home. His beginnings musically began when he began to sneak his dad's saxophone away and take it to school without his dad knowing and starting to get lessons at school. His lessons at school, however, were amongst the least significant of the opportunities in front of him because Philadelphia at the time, in the late 40s and the 1950s, was absolutely chock a block with either established jazz stars or people who would be jazz stars in the very near future. And he lived right around the corner from the Heath brothers, Percy, Tootie, and Jimmy. He took saxophone lessons from Jimmy Heath, and by the time that he got to South Philadelphia High School, he was in a musical environment at school which included a whole bunch of future famous names. People like Bobby Timmons, Fabian, Chubby Checker, and Frankie Avalon. In the school band, he settles on baritone and he ends up playing in a horn section which included Frankie Avalon on trumpet. But despite all of these musical connections, Earland would tell interviewers later on that he considered his school musical training to be poor, and that his great musical awakening actually happened in Atlantic City. It was in Atlantic City that he and many of his musically inclined friends, while underage, would learn their chops playing in the house bands in nightclubs and strip bars. And it was in these clubs that he first heard the great soul jazz music being played by people like Wild Bill Davis, Jimmy Smith, and Jack McDuff. At this point, and really throughout his career, it wasn't only about soul for him when it came to saxophone. His listening preferences were people like John Coltrane and Wayne Shorter. But at this point, the sound of the Hammond was seeping into his brain, and right after school, he signs up to play with the organist Jimmy McGriff in his trio. He said he dug McGriff's sound because he had this locked in heavy bass sound which eluded a lot of the other players. While touring with McGriff, he asked him to show him a few things, and thus it was over the course of a few months, here and there, before gigs and intermissions or so on, he basically taught himself how to play. After about a year with McGriff, Earland goes back to Philadelphia and in 1963-64 starts up his own trio. In that first trio, he included a friend from high school I didn't mention before, a very talented guitarist called Pat Martino, who of course goes on to have a respectable jazz career of his own, plus the drummer Bobby Durham. Martino sticks with the Earland trio for a while. Eventually he leaves, and another guitarist comes in, a younger player from Pittsburgh, a guy called Jimmy Ponder. With Ponder on board, Earland takes his trio to New York. In 1966, makes his first recording ever, and of course his first recording as a leader, for a small label called Choice, best known, well, really for not much, but if known for anything, for a series of singles put out by Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. The LP they made is called Boss Organ, which actually sounds pretty good. Didn't shift many copies, but both Earland and Ponder sound pretty progressive for the soul scene around that time. Actually, it's not true that's his recording debut, because when he's living in Philly in 1964, he puts out a single at least on an outfit called Quaker Records by Charlie Earland Jr. and his band called Daily Double Part 1. They stick around in New York, based out of Harlem, and Earland gets a break about a year and a half later, give or take, when the saxophonist Lou Donaldson takes a shine to his playing. As Earland tells the story, they're playing a gig in Harlem. In the intermission, Lou Donaldson walks up. He's got a copy of his hit record, Alligator Boogaloo, under his arm, gives Earland a copy, says, learn the songs on here. I'll give you a call and come and gig with me next week. Earland thinks to himself, great, learns the songs, shows up to the Donaldson gig, gets up on stage, starts playing with them, and Donaldson doesn't call any of the songs which he's learned. But he must have done pretty well, fake it till you make it, or so on, because he stuck with Donaldson for a bit anyway. Earland considered this time with Donaldson, which I think was probably about a year or something like that, as his great apprenticeship, not so much in music, but in the music business, teaching him how to run a band, how to stay afloat amongst all the sharks, and so on. And he's on two very good records that Donaldson makes for Blue Note. Those records both come out in 1969. They were at a time when Donaldson was capitalizing on the popularity of James Brown. Say It Loud is the first one, and Everything I Do Gonna Be Funky is the other. That same year, Earland also makes another LP for a tiny label, Rare Bird Records, called Black Power. And all this is enough to convince Prestige Records to sign him to a multi-album deal. First record that Earland makes for Prestige, recorded in '69, comes out in early 1970. It's called Black Talk. That included some of the players from Donaldson's band, Idris Muhammad on drums in particular, but also Melvin Sparks, the great guitarist. It's a big hit by jazz standards. It even makes an appearance on the lower reaches of the Billboard Albums chart. Entering the greatest phase of his career, Earland goes on now to make 10 records for Prestige in the next 4 years, 7 in the studio and 3 live efforts. The music is consistently good on these records, and what's also impressive is the caliber of sidemen that he had playing for him. These included people like Grover Washington, to whom he gave a recording debut, Freddie Hubbard, Lee Morgan, Billy Cobham, and Joe Henderson. Earland's live records sold pretty well. This is the third of the 3 live records he made, and it's made, as I mentioned, at the Lighthouse Cafe in Hermosa Beach during a fall 1972 swing through California. The Lighthouse, of course, is a legendary venue in jazz. It features in La La Land, or was it Moonlight? And it's the setting for some 40 live recordings. Although by October 9th, 1972, when this recording is made, its best days, its legendary days, were kind of behind it. It's mixed by Baker Bigsby at Village Recorders in LA, and Charles Earland supervises all this as the producer. Earland, of course, is on organ, and he's joined by a guy called Elmer Coles on trumpet. Elmer Coles, I don't think, although I stand to be corrected, is related to Johnny Coles of trumpet fame. Elmer Coles has a very low profile nationally, if any. He was a bit of a regional trumpet hero, apparently in Virginia, where he played for a long-standing, famous local R&B band called the Divots. Clifford Adams is on trombone, much better known for his later participation as a member of Kool and the Gang. Jimmy Vass is on alto and soprano sax. He would go on to a pretty creditable career as a session guy in the 1970s, as would Darrell Washington, who's playing drums here. But neither of those guys can hold a candle to the session career of Kenneth Nash, who's on congas here, who would go on to play with pretty much everybody in the 70s and 80s and would eventually found his own recording studio. Finally, Earland's regular bandmate, the excellent Maynard Parker, is on guitar. Side one starts with Smiling. Earland says, everybody ready? Then off they go. They're just cooking right from the start. This track, memorable for a couple of reasons. One is the great interplay between Earland and Parker, his guitar player. And secondly, this really uplifting, cheerful riff. Then we move into We've Only Just Begun, better known as a Carpenter's number, one of the all-time syrupiest 1970s ballads that ever was. But in Earland's hands, it's a whole new thing. Move over, Karen Carpenter. It's a toe tapper. The final track on side one, Black Gun, is the first Earland original, which has Earland cranking up the tempo at the start, hands over to Elmer Coles, and then this smoking percussion section. This track is fire. Side two begins with Spinky, which is the other Earland composition. This is as groovy and cooking as all the rest of the tracks in this record, although Jimmy Vass brings a kind of an avant-garde feel to his solo. Next is Eddie Harris's composition, Freedom Jazz Dance, which brings the percussion section to the fore, and that leads into the final track, Moon Train, which just is more of what is already this whipped up cauldron of energy and emotion that this whole gig has been. That energy is just leaping through the speakers, and you can only imagine what it was like in the club. This record is a definite pickup for any fans of soul jazz, of early 70s jazz funk, and needless to say, it's a pickup for anybody who's a fan of the Hammond organ. If it's not the most impeccably recorded album at the time, that was often the case with records made at the Lighthouse, it more than makes up for it by capturing, I think, the incredible energy and interplay that Earland had with his audiences around this time. The label it comes out on, Prestige, has a very strong soul jazz catalog, and this is a strong entry in that catalog. And for me, it's a very healthy 4 out of 5 stars.